So we live in a state where we have voted for a lot of politicians, or not voted for them, in the case of Larry Elder, who have actively set very, very, very ambitious targets for decarbonization. So let me just quickly unpack what I mean by that a little bit. We have assigned ourselves a trajectory. We have described a trajectory through which population in California will continue to grow. GDP per capita will continue to grow. But over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we will be bound, to some extent, binding is a complicated word, to certain pathways related to decarbonization. So we've already seen in California, you've seen solar installations, you've seen wind, and you've seen that we've invested a lot of money in intermittent sources that we can add to the grid. And during the day, there have been short periods where we've been at 100% renewable energy. But then at night, batteries are limited by physics, and the amount of solar energy or wind that we can store when the wind's not blowing, the sun is not shining, is pretty low. So we need, in order to decarbonize fully, we need not just intermittence, and not just the specific intermittence, we need a portfolio of intermittence that may include offshore wind, which has a higher cost and intrudes on some pretty vulnerable ecosystems. So there are some pretty significant ecology risk with that, right? But to get to a situation where we're emitting maybe 20, 30% of what we are now at most in 2045 or 2050, right? That's transforming our grid almost entirely, right? That's 1 out of 3 or more people having EVs and a reliable EV charging network. That's making heavy stuff using sunlight and water and electrolyzers to basically make hydrogen as a fuel, a carrier for producing things that require high pressure and heating. So decarbonization is challenging and expensive, and there is a lot of inertia in the system. The supply of oil continues to grow. By 2030, the supply of oil will continue to grow, and there will actually be a demand-supply mismatch with regard to oil. But to get to the goals that we talk about, 2.5 degrees of warming, 2 degrees of warming, avoiding 2.5 degrees of warming, staying under 2.5, staying under 2, any of that requires immediate transformation, and we have to pull every lever that we can. And one of those technologies, and Connor's going to talk about this, is actually trying to generate energy from turbines offshore. And the scale and intrusiveness of this and the time in which we expect to ramp this up is extremely quick, right? California's plans have a good deal of this baked in. And I want to commend Connor for being an outstanding student and really somebody who is as or more receptive to feedback and willing to improve his work and just conducting himself in a first-class manner at every time I've interacted with him since I met him over 2 years ago in my undergraduate class. So somebody that's been really a privilege to get to know, who will be continuing as one of my TAs this summer, a position that has been held by some incredible people, including the incredible Hannah, who's here right now. But Connor's presentation is Potential Floating Offshore Wind Energy Impacts on Marine Ecosystems. Connor.
Hello, everyone. My name is Connor, and I will be presenting on potential floating offshore wind energy impacts on marine ecosystems. Before I begin, I'd like to say a few thank yous to my chair, Corey Gabriel. It's been an absolute pleasure the last 2 years getting to know you, and your encouragement to not give up on this topic is a huge reason why I'm here. To Hannah, your attention to detail, when I seem to lack it, was such a tremendous help on this project, and it wouldn't have come together without you. To Dr. Ricky Erickson and Dr. Julia Dombrowski at the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, thank you for opening the door to offshore wind for me. I now realize what I want to do with my life. So that was huge. And finally, to my parents and my sister, Ben and Elaine and Caroline, from a very young age, you encouraged my curiosity and love for the ocean. And for that reason, I'm standing here today. So I'm going to start a little bit of scale and policy, go into why floating offshore wind, where in California, some of the challenges associated, and then dive into my project, the results, and some takeaways. So to begin, California aims to develop the world's largest floating offshore wind energy project with targets of 2 to 5 gigawatts of installed capacity by 2030 and 25 by 2045. That could mean up to 400 turbines by 2030 and 1,500 by 2045 along our coast. Each of these turbines could be up to 260 meters tall. That's 853 feet. That's about the size of the Eiffel Tower, with a 220-meter rotor diameter. And that in the background is sort of a concept image of a 12 to 14 megawatt turbine from GE, which we may expect on the coast. Some more on policy and scale. As Corey touched on, California is pushing for renewable energy. And driving that is Senate Bill 100 with a goal of 60% of retail electricity sold from renewable sources by 2030 and 100% of that by 2045. Additionally, and maybe more importantly, offshore wind is on the ballot this fall. AB 2208, the California Ports Development and Offshore Wind Infrastructure Bond Act, seeks to set aside $1 billion towards our offshore wind endeavors. And so all citizens of California should have the information available to them to decide on whether or not they want to support this piece of offshore wind. And then in this figure, you can see the U.S. offshore wind project pipeline, totaling just over 52,000 megawatts, which is just under the amount of offshore wind that there is in the world right now. So this is happening at a tremendous scale. Even Ohio is getting offshore wind. And this doesn't include potential projects in Washington State, Oregon, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii. So why floating offshore wind? So as we know, solar and wind provide ample amounts of clean energy during the day, but during peak hours of electricity demand between around 5 and 9 p.m., that coincides with a lapse in solar and wind generation. And without the use of large-scale batteries, solar and wind cannot be deployed at will. And this figure shows net load of California's grid, which can be understood in this sense as the amount of electricity that must be supplied by conventional power plants like gas peaker plants to meet remaining demand on the grid. More on why floating. Well, the California Outer Continental Shelf is very deep, and up to 2,000 meters deep, in fact. And additionally, the wind speeds in some of the areas offshore have been shown to peak between 5 and 9 p.m., which could tremendously help our intermittency problem. So where is this going to go? Well, in December 2022, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, facilitated the auction of sea space in California. 5 separate entities successfully bid on these 2 wind energy areas, which cover about 583 square miles. So from the lens of parts of government and industry, this is where the wind will be. They're looking at grid connection points and the highest annual wind speeds. And for context, the red and orange tend to indicate higher wind speeds. So this can give you some imagination of where we could see more wind in the future. From the lens of ocean users, conservationists, other parts of government dedicated to this, this is where the wind will be in relation to our national marine sanctuaries. You can see that in Morro Bay, it's sitting right up next to the border there. And then zooming in on Humboldt, from the lens of an indigenous commercial or recreational fisher who rely on salmon, this is where the wind will be. So what are the challenges associated with this? Well, as an emerging technology, little is known about the environmental impacts of floating offshore wind. Previous offshore wind projects do not occur at the scale, water depth, and under the same environmental conditions as California. For some perspective, in 2022, there was about 124 megawatts of floating offshore wind. That's less than 20 turbines. In this same year, there was 59,000 megawatts of fixed bottom. That's 5,000 turbines. Additionally, the technology for the floating platforms and the way that they're anchored onto the seabed, the final decisions haven't been made there. So that is a significant source of unknown. So my project, to inform the sustainable development of floating offshore wind in California, the California National Marine Sanctuary Foundation is developing the Offshore Wind Environmental Monitoring Guidance for the California Ocean Protection Council. This environmental monitoring guidance seeks to help facilitate knowledge sharing and best practices for potential impacts of floating offshore wind and how to monitor these impacts. In support of the environmental monitoring guidance, I reviewed scientific and gray literature and synthesized existing knowledge on potential offshore wind impacts to marine ecosystems. I then categorized the literature into 4 focus areas: marine mammals and sea turtles, birds and bats, fish and fishery ecology, and habitats and ecosystems. So within my review, I identified 61 pieces of literature, all published between 2009 and 2024, with 76% published after 2020. Geographically, most of the research was conducted in Europe, specifically in the North Sea, about 30%. And then at a finer spatial scale, 100% of the studies were conducted in less than 150 meters of water, with 83% of those conducted in depths less than or equal to 100 meters. And California's turbines could occur between 800 and 2,000 meters. So of my 4 focus areas, the most studied were marine mammals and sea turtles and fish and fishery ecology, with birds and bats as the least studied. And 75% of those studies examined impacts to whales, birds, pelagic communities, with less than 25% examining sea turtles, bats, benthic communities, or atmospheric and oceanographic processes like upwelling. The most studied impacts were habitat alterations and behavior changes, with the least studied physical processes like upwelling and nutrient cycling, like primary productivity fluctuations. Looking specifically at marine mammals and sea turtles, impacts included noise, electromagnetic fields or EMFs, entanglement, collision, displacement, and attraction. Suction caissons, which is like an upside-down bucket, dead weight or embedded anchors cause the lowest noise pollution for anchoring turbines into the ground. And the lowest entanglement risk is from taut mooring configurations, so very little slack. And although marine mammals and sea turtles may ignore noise and EMFs for foraging opportunities created by the turbines, and significantly larger turbines were found to generate greater noise pollution than smaller turbines. And on the West Coast, vessel collision is the #1 cause of mortality for blue whales and the second highest for humpback whales. And offshore wind means a lot more vessels in the water. Additionally, both of those species were identified as likely to occur in wind energy areas. For birds and bats, impacts include collision, avoidance, attraction, and habitat alterations. The most common seabird species in Europe and migrating bat species in the North Sea show possible avoidance of turbines when they're breeding and attraction during foraging. And this could be because insects are attracted to the lights of turbines, and the birds and bats will follow. More specific to California, 3 species of migrating Pacific flyway geese were recently identified to cruise at altitudes that were equal to turbines, which could be a potential source of impact for these species. For fish and fishery ecology, impacts included noise, EMF, habitat alterations, displacement, and avoidance. There exists mostly a species-specific understanding of the impacts of EMFs, so it's hard to make general conclusions. And EMFs also produce a range of impacts, from larval recruitment to increased foraging behavior. And specific to California, there was a subsea cable installed in the Bay Area, and that subsea cable and the EMFs that it produced did not negatively impact salmon migration, which could be very important for Humboldt. For habitats and ecosystems, in the last few years, a modeling study by UC Santa Barbara found that a megawatt of offshore wind delivered to the grid would generate about 15 kilograms of CO2. That's less than solar. Additionally, anti-corrosive materials used to protect steel components have the potential for heavy metal trophic transfer in marine ecosystems. Furthermore, primary productivity fluctuations of up to 10% were found to occur in wind farms. Interesting when it comes to floating technology, it actually has a higher risk of spreading invasive species to wind energy areas because the turbines are dragged from port. And I think most importantly, the CEC modeled a full build out of turbines, about 20 gigawatts, and looked at regional fluctuations in upwelling. And they found essentially a net increase in upwelling. But their final statement was, there are, and I quote, unknown ecological consequences due to upwelling and atmospheric circulation changes. So for further research and to better understand the impacts that floating offshore wind may have on California's marine ecosystems, I think we need to look heavier at the potential for heavy metal trophic transfer, the effects of different mooring systems, the artificial reef effect of floating turbines, the effect of floating turbines on upwelling atmospheric circulation, and finally, continued investigation of spatial and temporal distribution of California's species. Floating offshore wind remains a novel and emerging technology and should be approached in this manner. However, its proliferation in Europe, Asia, and the East Coast do suggest a degree of feasibility and manageability, and knowledge of adjacent technologies, such as fixed bottom offshore wind and fixed bottom and floating oil and gas platforms, provide valuable insights that we can establish a baseline from where to start from. And finally, coordination among all stakeholders, systematic monitoring, and adaptive management strategies are key to reducing any uncertainty with floating offshore wind and mitigating any impacts that may arise. And if you're interested, I built a website that sort of, if you don't feel like reading my paper, you can go check out the website. And it's not fully complete, so very open to suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Did you look at costs at all? And particularly operation and maintenance costs, O&M. It would seem to me at 1,000 meters and very far offshore, servicing these gigantic machines would be quite complex and expensive.
Yeah, a great question. This was something that I was always thinking about too. And the focus of my study was not on is the cost of how expensive is offshore wind, how is the cost going to change. But I know that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has a few studies done on this. And so I would point you in that direction because I feel like I can't answer that based on my research.
Tested?
Yeah, so there's about 124 megawatts of floating turbines right now in the world, so that's around 20. But an exclusive floating project at the scale in California has not been tested.
Is there 20 floating projects or 20 units?
20 turbines,
20 turbines.
More or less.
Where are they located?
Mostly in Europe. In the North Sea, Scotland, I think England, Maine actually has a single floating turbine. Yeah.
The one that's in Maine already, has there been any environmental impact studies done with that?
Well, it's a test, it's a pilot project. So I think whoever's in charge of that must be more controlled. But I can't speak to that now. One more.
Do local communities know about this at all, or is it more academic? And if they do know about it, has there been any pushback before it's?
Yes to all of that. It's a very complicated issue, and I think the local communities could speak better to whether or not they've felt engaged. I will say, I went to a conference in Sacramento, and an indigenous leader spoke from Northern California. And this isn't their entire perspective. This is one person's perspective. They said something along the lines of, we've seen a boom and bust industry in this region before, and this feels no different. So that is one perspective that I've heard. Thank you. Oh.
Is it possible to have no offshore wind turbines and do it all on land? Would that provide enough power to California?
I don't know what the land use would be to have that same amount of turbines, but I think we still can tell BOEM no, we don't want the turbines. That might still be possible.